Welcome, everyone. Rabbi Michael Tevye Cohen here with a Lunch and Learn presentation on Fiddler on the Roof and on the creator of Fiddler on the Roof, Sholem Aleichem, the great Yiddish writer who lived from 1859 to 1915 and wrote the stories Tevye the Milkman, upon which Fiddler on the Roof is based. My idea for this Lunch and Learn has actually grown into a two-part presentation because as I looked deeper into Sholem Aleichem, I found not only did he write wonderful stories, his life is in itself a fabulous story. So I want to share in this part one today with you much about Sholem Aleichem with some tastes of Fiddler on the Roof. And then part two, when we return to this subject, will be about the making of the play and the movie. Without any further ado, Sholem Aleichem's greatest triumph, Fiddler on the Roof, memories and cultural meaning of the Yiddish world he brought to life. Here is a portrait of Sholem Aleichem, 100 or so years after his death. I'm going to give you the musical introduction and taste to the world that he created in the Tevye stories. Tradition.
Here, in our little village of Anatevka, you might say every one of us is a fiddler on the roof, trying to scratch out a pleasant, simple tune without breaking his neck. It isn't easy. You may ask, why do we stay up there if it's so dangerous? Well, we stay because Anatevka is our home. And how do we keep our balance? That I can tell you in one word. Tradition! Because of our traditions, we've kept our balance for many, many years. Here in Anatevka, we have traditions for everything. How to sleep, how to eat, how to work, how to wear clothes. For instance, we always keep our heads covered and always wear a little prayer shawl. This shows our constant devotion to God. You may ask, how did this tradition get started? I'll tell you. I don't know. But it's a tradition. And because of our tradition, every one of us knows who he is and what God expects him to do.
Day and night must scramble for a living, feed a wife and children, say his daily prayers, and who has a right as master of the house to have the final word at home?
Raise a family and run the home. So Papa's free to read the holy book.
born outside of Kiev in 1859, which is also the time that Yiddish, which had been spoken for hundreds of years and was the main language of the Jews in the Pale of Settlement, that area of Poland and Ukraine and Russia, but Yiddish hadn't been written that much, let alone printed and published. And it was right around the time of Sholem's birth that printing houses started to print some books and some journals in Yiddish. And Sholem Aleichem grew up with a love for this language. He was also very intelligent and learned and could write beautiful Hebrew and Russian. His father encouraged these pursuits. His father was a struggling businessman who might have done well, but for, among other things, he was swindled by a partner who took all of the deeds of their jointly owned properties and had them rewritten in his own sole name. And Sholem's father, Nachum Rabinovich, and Rabinovich was the official family name, but Sholem was known more commonly as Sholem, son of Nachum. The father didn't want to deal with the Russian courts. He didn't think as a Jew he would get much justice there, abided this loss. He also lost his wife, Sholem's mother, who died and left him with a large number of kids. I think there were 8 kids in the family. And Sholem's father found somebody to remarry, younger woman, but didn't tell her he had all these kids. He had shipped them off to different relatives temporarily while he wooed and won this woman over. She didn't know what she was getting into. She turned out to be a nagging and cruel, abusive stepmother, but no doubt she felt swindled herself by suddenly being presented with all these children to take care of and a man of lesser means than Nachum had portrayed himself to be. And one of the first things that Sholem Aleichem did in writing was to compile a dictionary of the Yiddish curse words his stepmother used, because she used so many of them. And when later on he shared this with his father was delighted. Even the stepmother apparently couldn't stop cackling over it. So she eased up on him, whereas before she had begrudged him the money that for the kerosene that he used to keep a lamp lit so he could write at night. She eased up some, and the father embraced his writing of Yiddish, although he had wanted him to pursue Hebrew letters. Hebrew was just being reborn as a literature, a language of literature. There were people were starting to write beautiful things in Hebrew, and Sholem's father had hoped his son would do that as part of the Haskalah, as the Enlightenment reached the Jews of Eastern Europe. But Sholem had a passion for Yiddish. It's translated as jargon, common language, not a highbrow literary language. But Sholem said there's millions of us speaking this language. It's the language that can reach people, whether educated or not. That's what he wanted to write in. Now, he did capture the hearts of the masses. And let me show you, at the end of his life would come in the United States, in New York. And when he died in 1915, the funeral procession, which drew 150 to 250,000 people out into the streets as it winded its way from the Bronx down through Manhattan and into Brooklyn, was the largest funeral procession New York City had ever seen. Here's the cortege, and you can see the lines of policemen. There were apparently lines of 50 policemen on either side to hold back the crowds. It's estimated that the most beloved character Sholem Aleichem would create was undoubtedly Tevye, the Melchicher, the milkman. And some of the issues with Tevye are also present through much of Sholem's other writing. And I think it captures my imagination too. That is the question of identity. How do we blend tradition and modernity? It's an uncomfortable balance. It was for Jews 120 years ago, whether they were still in Russia or coming to America. And I think to some extent, those questions persist with us today. How do we embrace our Jewish identity and balance all the questions of modernity as citizens of the United States and of this world of the 21st century? So another part of the context for Sholem Aleichem and his work is the anti-Semitism of the society and of the government of Russia that had so much effect on people's lives during this time. The assassination of Tsar Alexander was blamed on the Jews and led to pogroms in 1881. The pogroms did not directly affect Sholem and his family, but impediments of being a Jew in Tsarist Russia continued to pop up as we look at this story. Now, Sholem was invited to matriculate at Zhytomyr Teachers Institute, where he would have been able to study to become a rabbi. Good question whether he wanted to be a rabbi, but the opportunity to study there was actually taken away from him before he even could begin, because they realized he was going to become eligible for conscription in the Tsar's army during the time he would have been at the school. And that was a 25-year term of service. So that meant they felt it was a waste of a spot on a student who wouldn't be able to finish the program. So instead of that, at age 17, Sholem left home and began his writing and doing odd jobs. He struggled. He enlisted in another program to become what it was known as a crown rabbi, which would become a character in some of his later stories. The crown rabbi was a rabbi to be for a town, but also owed duties to the state to keep track of heads for tax purposes and conscription purposes for the Tsar's army. Well, Sholem was discontent with that lot, and he left that program before he finished. And he found his way through good fortune into a position as a tutor in perhaps a most fortunate house of all that he could have found. Elimelech Loyev was a very successful Jewish businessman who managed estates and apparently managed them with incredible care and success. He was a mensch of a human being by all reports, even going from house to house on the estates to see that the peasants and their families receive vaccinations in a time when vaccinations were new and people didn't all accept them. Deja vu. The more we see about history, the more we see it replays itself. But that's the kind of person Elimelech was. And he welcomed Sholem in to tutor his 13-year-old daughter, who was about 5 years younger than Sholem Aleichem. Sholem was there for 3 years, and the tutoring was going very well. This young woman, Olga. Loyev used his connections to enable Sholem to not get drafted in the military after all. He was a tutor who was appreciated in the household for 3 years until a visiting aunt reported to Olga's father that she saw the two of them, Sholem and Olga, eating from the same plate and apparently just very familiar with each other. And so the next day, Sholem found an envelope of money with his payment and a carriage waiting outside with instructions, leave and do not return. So he lost his position. He continued to make his way through other writing jobs. Somebody saw his name in print and reported it to Olga. Some 3 years after his expulsion from the family, they found each other and eloped. They got married, and her father's response to this was to accept Sholem Aleichem back into his family, this time as a son. So it had a happy ending. I have a picture here of a young Sholem Aleichem with his bride Olga in 1883, year of their marriage. And they made a successful couple throughout their lives. A surprise turn, Elimelech was worried over something and suddenly fell ill and died. And his estate, which was quite huge at the time, went not just to his daughter, but actually went to her husband, Sholem, by Russian law. So the struggling writer became somebody who could afford to invest himself in writing Yiddish language and follow his passion to develop Yiddish culture and encourage more writing. Want to publish several books that would be collections of Yiddish writings. And he sought out other writers and paid them for stories that they would write in Yiddish to be included in these books. He included his own writings in it. This Volksbibliothek was something that consumed him to great length. And it was a means of celebrating and raising up the quality of Yiddish writing. Unfortunately, no sooner had he made a fortune and enjoyed the trappings of a wealthy living, but by speculating in the market and over-investing himself in his writing and not paying attention to his fortune, he ended up losing the fortune within several years after that. Sholem had to scrape together work and writing to support his family. Where he had been the big macher, suddenly he was cut down to size. But his passion for Yiddish writing never. So I called Sholem Aleichem a rascal before. Let me expand on that a little bit. He wrote about himself and his writing that it's almost a sickness with me to point out the ludicrous in everything and everyone. He just couldn't help making fun of everything. I would describe it almost as a Groucho style of zaniness, at least in some points in his early writing. There's one publication called The Intercepted Letters, which were supposedly written by various figures and then intercepted. And in this exchange, one writer doubts that Sholem Aleichem exists, goes searching for him and finds no trace. But then another letter attests to having seen Sholem Aleichem sailing off in a hot air balloon. And then a third writer recounts of his embarrassment at having thought that Sholem Aleichem actually existed. And then that's followed up by a scene where Sholem Aleichem actually appears at his door. So you can see the zaniness in the writing. And there are some concerns that animate Sholem Aleichem's writing that I think are important to highlight. One, he was very upset with how society privileged wealth over merit and the mistreatment by society of the poor. And he was outraged by what he felt were fraudulent Hasidic rebbes and observance without morality. How the moral goodness of a modernizing type of person could go unrewarded in the world. Another final concern that I'll note for him was Zionism, the possibilities. Let me say that another thing that Sholem Aleichem wrote was, I have no use for piety. Honesty is what counts. I think these concerns are things that many of us can relate to. And if we pick up a copy of one of his collections of Tevye, the Dairyman, these things speak to us. Sholem Aleichem also had a passion for literature, Russian literature and world literature. And Nikolai Gogol was from the same province as Sholem Aleichem. And as a Ukrainian, perhaps that emboldened Sholem Aleichem to think that as an ethnic person, in his case, a Jew as opposed to Ukrainian, he could still succeed. His writing could become noticed in the world. Gogol also was fascinated with the absurd. And one of passages from Dead Souls, which is Gogol's perhaps most famous work, Sholem Aleichem wrote down and kept this in his papers throughout his life. The quote he wrote down was, "It seems we are fated to observe the great tumultuous life with open laughter and hidden tears." That combination of pathos, pain, but laughter, which I think resonates with the Fiddler story and how it was brought to us in the 20th century. Other figures that also played a role for him were Turgenev, who was absorbed with the conflict of the generations, and Chekhov and Dickens, who Sholem Aleichem was aware not only wrote about the greater canvas of life, but also participated in public readings of his work, which Sholem Aleichem would later do. And one other person I want to note here was Maxim Gorky, who was uncompromising and rebellious and inspired people. Here you see Sholem Aleichem wearing his hair the same way as Gorky and wearing a Gorky type shirt. And this is something that he'll poke fun of himself at in his writings too. later on. But there's no doubt that Gorky's stance for change in the system was something that Sholem Aleichem embraced. These writers were not all anti-Semites, along with the strong anti-Semitism of Russian society. And some of them came to Sholem Aleichem's support when he sought to enlist them to write things against the anti-Jewish policies of Russian society. Another example of Sholem Aleichem's wit and zaniness is an example of a rejection letter in one of his first published writings. The rejection letter is so extreme, it gives you a sense of that zaniness. We, the undersigned members of the editorial board, swear to you by all that is holy that you cannot write, that you will never be a writer, that as long as you live, not a word of yours will be published anywhere. And if you might possibly think that you have an ounce of talent, allow us to tell you again and again that you are entirely and terribly mistaken. That seems to be a letter that he fancified in his writing, but to get the point across that this is what the young struggling writer had to deal with. Sholem Aleichem also despised the most popular writer in Yiddish of his day, someone known as Shomer, who had written about 200 novels with preposterous plots and unrealistic characters, and the dialogue. That was what Sholem Aleichem couldn't stand, was that it didn't seem to resemble real life people with whom he was familiar, referring to Shomer as one of those novelists who cook their novels like potatoes by the dozens. And as I said, he used his wealth to try to further publication of Yiddish writing, which was an extraordinary step against the grain when most people were funding and supporting Hebrew writing as the movement for renewal amongst the Jewish people. Sholem Aleichem said, hey, this is where we're living. This is who we are. This needs to be promoted as well. And he wrote, I feel a bond between me and the people that is between all the people who read jargon, which again is how he referred to Yiddish. It seems to me like I need them and they need me. Let me take you now to 1894 in the summer, when Sholem Aleichem rented a small place of very meager status for his family outside of Summer Cottage. And that's where he met Tevye, the dairyman, and wrote the first of 7 stories that he would write over the next 20 years, returning to this theme of Tevye. The number of daughters that Tevye had, according to Sholem Aleichem, varied, as if Sholem himself couldn't keep track of them. It seems initially to have been 7. And that brings up the Yiddishism, Sieben Töchter ist kein Gelächter. 7 daughters is no laughing matter, because of all those dowries. That in the first story, and I'm showing here another picture of Chagall with another fiddler of the shtetl, and then a couple more Chagall pictures, themes that Chagall would return to. Here's Moses speaking with an angel. In the first Tevye story, Tevye is not yet a milkman. He's simply making a living hauling logs, a backbreaking laborer. Comes across 2 women who are stranded, 2 wealthy women, and he helps them out. And they reward him so that he's able to buy a cow. And in response to them calling him a hero, Tevye offers an example of the sayings for which he becomes famous. Sayings that are neither exactly learned nor ignorant. They're rather fresh colloquial turns on classic phrases from rabbinic sayings. And Tevye makes an effort to his small but noble efforts to maintain his own dignity with these phrases. I have an example of one of them here. Tevye takes a saying from Pirkei Avot, the sayings of the fathers, which is, in a place where there's no mensch, do your utmost to be a mensch. B'makom she'ein ish, hishtadel lihyot ish. When they call him a hero, Tevye says, B'makom she'ein ish, in a place where there's no mensch, a herring too is a fish. And it sounds a little preposterous, but he seems to be saying essentially, he's no hero, but he did what he could and it sufficed for the task at hand. It's not inapt, his saying, and it's not a malapropism. It's just a turn on a learned phrase that he's turning into something unexpected and amusing and humble. And that's his way of humbly acknowledging his own limited efforts. And that brings up something else that his biographer, Jeremy Dauber, in a recent biographical work, says that I think is very fascinating about Tevye. The Tevye uses these religious texts for the most religious of reasons to explain his situation to himself, if no one else, to give himself fortitude and hope. I think that's fascinating because it takes religion to a place that maybe many of us can relate to. Maybe we don't think of religion this way, but I think there's something quite deep in it, a place to explain my own situation to myself. Why am I here? What's going on? And to give myself fortitude, strength to go on. I think that's what religion comes down to for many of us. And for many of us who have walked away from traditional Jewish practice, the same thing might still hold true. We might not call it religion, but we do try to assess existentially, what are we doing here? Why? What is our purpose? And to give ourselves strength to go on. Now, you've learned here about Sholem making a fortune and losing a fortune. And we have set the context here and introduced Tevye. Here, I think it's time to bring in the inimitable Zero Mostel, who played Tevye in the original Broadway production in 1964. And there's no recording of that early production, but there is a recording of Zero Mostel doing If I Were a Rich Man later on in his life awards. Here, let's take a look at that.
Dear God, you know, you make many, many poor people. I know it's no great shame to be poor. It's no great honor either. What would have been so terrible if I had a small fortune? If I were a rich man, all day long I'd pity, pity, bum. If I were a wealthy man, I wouldn't have to work hard. If I were a pretty, pretty rich, title man, I'd build a tall house with rooms by the dozen right in the middle of the town. A fine tin roof with real wooden floors below. There could be one long staircase just going up and one even longer coming down, and one more leading nowhere just for show. I'd fill my yard with chicks and turkeys and geese and ducks for the town to see and hear, squawking just as noisily as they can. And each sound will land like a trumpet on the ear, as if to say, here lives a wealthy man. If I were a rich man, all day long I'd pity, pity, bum. If I were a wealthy man, I wouldn't have to work hard. Diddle, I'd see my wife, my Goldie, looking like supervising meals to a heart's delight. I see her putting on nails and strutting like a peacock. Boy, what a happy mood she's in. Screaming at the servants day and night. The most important men in town will come to fawn on me. They will ask me to advise them like a Solomon the wise. If you please, Reptavia, pardon me, Reptavia, posing problems that would cross a rabbi's eyes. And it won't make one bit of difference if I answer right or wrong. When you're rich, they think you really know. If I were rich, I'd have the time that I lack to sit in a synagogue and pray, and maybe have a seat by the eastern wall. And I discuss the holy books with the learned men 7 hours every day. That would be the sweetest thing of all. If I were a rich man, a whole day long I'd pay it up. If I were a wealthy man, I wouldn't have to work. Lord, who made the lion and the lamb, you decreed I should be what I am. Would it spoil some vast eternal plan if I were a wealthy man?
Now let's return to our story where Sholem Aleichem returns to Tevye and writes a second story entitled Der Yid. In this story, Tevye blows a fortune, the fortune that he's just made, most of it, by investing with Sholem Aleichem's other serial character, the ever-failing Menachem Mendel. And in that, you see Tevye returning to the impoverished life. He's a milkman now. He has a cow. Only in the third story that Sholem would write, called Today's Children, does he start to deal with Tevye's daughters. And here he creates the story of Tzeitel and the arranged marriage to Laser Wolf. Tevye ends up cutting off the arrangement on behalf of his daughter after she weeps to him that she can't go through with this marriage that he's arranged for her. She's in love with Model and the tailor's son. And so Tevye ends up taking his daughter's part and breaking off the arrangement and comes up with a wild story to persuade his wife to go along with Tzeitel's marriage to her intended, the impoverished, humble tailor, Model Kumzoil. There's a fascinating twist here in what Sholem Aleichem has done, because I mentioned Turgenev before, who's famous for a work entitled Fathers and Sons. And he's one of a number of great writers who took on the idea of generational conflict. But Sholem Aleichem is the first one to write this conflict from the father's perspective, rather than from the child's perspective. And Tevye himself is working to arrange the marriage, but his heart is able to open and hear Tzeitel's lament and take her part, change events on her behalf so she doesn't have to run away. Now, you know, Tevye will be tested even more and more severely by the subsequent daughters, whose choices are first a revolutionary, and then in the third case, someone who's not Jewish. But here you see Sholem Aleichem becoming an artist, a poet, and writer of the people, in the words of his biographer, Dauber. He created a fictional town, which he calls Kazrelevka, meaning God surrounds and supports me, after he had earlier used Berdichev as a setting. Berdichev is a city in Ukraine. Sholem Aleichem's characters that he were creating were often failures at life, but they didn't allow poverty to degrade them. And Sholem Aleichem was in the process of mastering the monologue. In 1903, Sholem Aleichem gave up his other business interests and his employments to concentrate and focus just on his prolific writing and to begin touring and doing public readings. And he went to as far as Warsaw and Vilna and was met by huge crowds of people who were adoring his writings, or that they were seeing being published in serial parts in journals and then the first newspaper of Yiddish. But there was censorship in Russia because the Tsar was teetering. And there were pogroms that broke out in 1903 in Kishinev. So that was causing Sholem Aleichem and others despair over whether Jewish efforts were ever going to amount to anything to create a fair and safe life in Russia. Here I want to mention Zionism again. The Zionist movement actually had seeds well before Theodor Herzl. And even 15 years before Herzl wrote The Jewish State, there was a movement called Hibat Zion that was setting the scene and that young people in Russia were flocking to. And Sholem Aleichem among them had embraced that. He wrote a pamphlet after Herzl wrote The Jewish State. Sholem Aleichem wrote his own. Sholem Aleichem's pamphlet outsold Herzl's 27,000 to 3,000 in terms of the Yiddish press. Now, Herzl was being published in other languages too, but Sholem Aleichem had a voice and had a passion to see this come to reality. But he also had some despair, thinking whether it ever would. Events continue to get dire. In January 1905, the Tsar's troops firing on people in what's called Bloody Sunday, when 70 people were shot and killed and 200 to 300 were wounded. And later that year, in October, the Tsar offered the October Manifesto, which was offering a parliament, a Duma, sort of a fig leaf that he was offering to make some changes that were superficial. But even these superficial changes led to a reaction by what was considered the right in Russia, led by a group called the Black Hundreds, who particularly aimed at the Jews. But they didn't want any of these reforms, and they were blaming the Jews for them, and it led to more terrible pogroms. And Sholem Aleichem actually moved his family from their home into a hotel with other Jewish families, and they were safe there, but witnesses describe the police and the army joining in to the looting and violence rather than stopping it. And Sholem Aleichem realized that it just was not safe to continue to try to do his work, or rewarding to do his work in Russia. So as he lost hope in Russia, he began to be tempted by the fact that there were hundreds of thousands of Yiddish speakers now in New York. And it led him to decide to take his family to the US. As a writer, Sholem Aleichem had all kinds of problems that we might not think of today, but journals didn't pay very much for his writing, and sometimes they didn't fulfill their contracts and actually pay anything. Sometimes they didn't even bother with a contract, and they just ran his work without permission. This was happening across the Yiddish-speaking world. So it was not easy to make a fortune, even for a fellow who was now one of the best loved and most recognized writers. And I'm going to conclude this presentation of part one with the song Matchmaker from the recent Yiddish revival of Fiddler that played on Broadway. Lest anyone think that Yiddish has gone away, please take note that this played for several years on Broadway. And there is a passionate joy amongst young people to learn Yiddish. I can't think of anything that would make Sholem Aleichem happier than to see his work portrayed as it was so recently on Broadway. Let's conclude this presentation with Matchmaker. Thank you. I look forward to seeing you next time to go into much more of the detail and richness about how Fiddler on the Roof was brought to Broadway and then to the screen and changed film history and Jewish history in some ways.
Die guck in dein Buch und such mir auf Kosten zu. Scharchente, mir nicht schon gleich. Bring ihm zu mir, schmal, lang und breit. Bring mir ein Ring und tu es nur gleich. Die Kinder soll werden Kodois. Der Tote darf auf Familie, die Mame darf verreichen, a Graf. Und ich darf mein Abgemine Woche nicht richtig und klug und scharf. Schaffen mir zu. Heit will ich heit, tu etwas tu. Sultan die Nacht, ihre Friede und Weg. Ich schaffen schon zu. Mir allein. Von warum bist du so verinteressiert mit Hassan im Haar? Und ich hab gemeint, dass dein Nose steckt nur in die Bücher. Und du hast geworfen an euch auf den Rebbensohn. Verwusst nicht? Wir haben einen einzigen Rebben und der Rebbe hat einen einzigen Sohn. Verwusst soll ich nicht werden das Beste? Weil du bist ein arm Kind von einem armen Heim. Ist dem Ersten, was Jente wird bringen, wirst du nehmen. Nicht also? Sicher also. Aber steht doch Punkt war dir, a schöner und jung, a 60er mit 4 Opera-Hosen, das ist stimmt, mit Masel und mit Broche bist du zu begehen, und was mit seiner Nein, weiß nicht allein. Aber ich hab ihm, guck an, wie sich geht, a lange ich breit Opera-Hosen, das ist great. Mit glebender Geschichte, als ist von Brampendick und Schlag der Nichte. Das ist dein Glück. Hast gemeint, bekommst da grad. Tu das Beste, was ich kann. Naden und jeches, mit Tolkien, Pocheches, mit Gitamanis Nem. Schartente, zes doch alleen. Ich bin sehr jung, es brennt nicht, ich mein. Uns nicht